ya, back at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya, coming at ya. Rhyme style disaster, coming at ya, back at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host Wilford Riley. We are joined again by the fan favorite Christy Kelly. And joining us there's no center square, but in the other square is Captain Guy Higgins. He is one of the contributing authors of a new book, Don't Give Up the Ship. Woke Politics Are Endangering Our Military and Our Nation by the Calvert Task Group. Here's the book. It's hard to see on here, but there's a nice little silhouette of a naval officer there and all that kind of stuff. And there's a ship right there, Bulgaria. Captain Higgins, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, it's good. I want to talk about this. I mean, we obviously talk about this problem a lot, but it's big and it has a lot of tentacles. And it's important to talk about the many ways it affects society. Otherwise, you just sound like some old guy who's just like, back in my day, people didn't care about this. And they look at you and they think that you're complaining about nothing. So, and I'm also happy, no offense, to have you here because this is one of the few times I don't get to be the old guy on the show. But so the book is Don't Give Up the Ship. And it's a collection it's a group of you, like it says, the Calvert group. So you're one of several contributors to the book. So can you talk about how this came together, like why it was important to write about it and how the group came together?
Absolutely, Charles. So it started off, the Calvert group started off 7 or 8 years ago as several of my classmates in the Atlanta, Georgia area, led by my classmate and longtime friend, Tom Burbage, wanted to get together and golf once a week. And they decided to call themselves the Calvert Group after the admiral who was superintendent of the Naval Academy when we were there, Jim Calvert, who was the CEO of the first submarine to surface at the North Pole. There's a piece of trivia that you don't need to know. And so they golfed and they call themselves the Calvert Group because Tom says we couldn't remember each other's emails. So we just built a group email and did that. Then about 4 years ago, Tom became aware of a incident, I'll call it, at the Naval Academy. And this was at the time of the George Floyd riots. One of the midshipmen, and we don't name him, one of the midshipmen had both his mother and father were police officers in the Los Angeles Police Department. And as is quite often the case these days, he took to social media to say things, never once identifying himself as a midshipman at the Naval Academy or indicating in any way that he was part of the Navy. Now, being 19 years old, he said things that probably when he's 35, he will wish he hadn't said. And the Academy initiated action against him when it was reported to them. And they were going to expel him and charge him for his education to that point, about $160,000. And Tom took issue with that because at no time had he actually violated any regulations. And a lawsuit was filed and he prevailed in the lawsuit. And he graduated and he just got his wings as a naval aviator and graduated from flight school as the #1 student in his class.
Wow.
And he will go on to be a fighter pilot. And I can say that since Bruce isn't here. But just is outstanding young man. The commanding officer of his training squadron said he's a prodigy. He is a natural at flying an airplane. So we feel pretty good about that. And he's on his way to what we hope will be a fine career. But that morphed into how did the Academy get into this situation? We started to look at it and look at the efforts that were going on, not just at the Naval Academy, but also at West Point and the Air Force Academy, and how critical race theory in its Marxist sense was being applied, that there are I'll use the CRT terms of oppressors and oppressed, but that's not really the way they looked at it. They looked at advantaged and disadvantaged groups, and they wanted to take action and use that to select people for admission to the academies. Now, there's no problem with having whoever at any one of the academies if they meet the criteria, satisfy the standards for acceptance of the academy. Got no problem with that at all. The question that we looking at the Naval Academy have not been able to get anybody to answer is, are they applying the same standards to everyone? And we still don't know that answer. And so we have a concern about that. And one of the things that the Naval Academy, when the superintendent briefs, one of the things that she briefs now, we have our first female superintendent, Vice Admiral Yvette Davids. And I've had the pleasure of meeting Admiral Davids, and she is just a firecracker. She really is. I'm really impressed with her. A lot of energy. I think she has some really good ideas, and will make a difference. But we're going to see how things play out, because she works for the Chief of Naval Operations, who works for the Secretary of the Navy, right up to the President. So when I was on active duty, one of the things we always said is, I support the President. And that's the job. If you can't do that, then you've got no business being there. So we'll see how this all plays out. But we are looking at the academy. Tom Burbage and I attended the last Board of Visitors meeting and listened to the briefs that were going on there. There was nothing overt, but it was interesting that the academy was 46% minorities. Now, we don't know exactly what they include in minorities, and we believe, or actually, Admiral Davids said there's double counting in there, because a Hispanic woman counts as both a female and a minority. So there's some double counting in there, and if you add up all the percentages, you get more than 100%. So we're just looking at that, and when we look at some of the reported data. It's interesting that there is one demographic that consistently over the last 5 or 6 years has graduated midshipmen and had them commissioned at about a 10% lower rate than the rest of the brigade. Is that a problem? Don't know. It's possible that it's just happenstance. But we want to understand, are we selecting young men and women to go into the Naval Academy when they're not prepared to satisfy the requirements of the academy and graduate and be commissioned? Now, I think it's important for me to do a little aside here. I was sworn as a midshipman on the 30th of June, 1965, and there were 1,480 some of us that were sworn in that day. 4 years later, we graduated 883. So we lost 600 of my classmates over the 4 years. Today, they lose about 100. They matriculate about 1,100 and lose about 100. And wow. It's not a relaxation of the rigor so much as that they invest a lot more effort in selecting men and women up front, rather than making broad selections and then seeing who can hack it, who gets thrown out. So it's a stated overt difference in the philosophy the academy has. Okay. But we would like to make sure that we're selecting the young men and women who are going to be the best leaders that we can provide, because quite frankly, the young men and women who volunteer to serve in the fleet, to serve in the Marine Corps, deserve only the very best leaders that this nation can provide, because some of them are going to be laying their lives on the line.
Right. Well,
and you need that leadership. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, before I was going to allow Christy and Will to comment, but before that, I do want to say, if you can give some people, I think it will help if we had a little understanding. You didn't mention the guy, which is fine, but some of the things he posted that got him in trouble that you thought would have been extreme for him to get in trouble for.
He came out and made some statements about that there should be more concern about the safety of the police officers who were out in the field attempting to maintain civil order, right, that there should be more concern about them and not all the concern about the people who were creating the problem in the first place.
Right. I just wanted context because so his parents were police officers, and this was during the protests.
It was.
And all he said was, we should be concerned
He
about
said
both, and not just
he
the
said
one.
things like we're being way too nice to the people that are rioting and burning things down, and we're not concerned about the safety of the police officers that are out there trying to maintain order.
And they wanted to remove. Wow, that sounds like my school board meetings. Christy, any thoughts on his introduction on how the guys came together and they started to be concerned about what's going on?
Yeah, so when I initially heard this topic, I thought that you were going to examine it from the standpoint of the, young men and women that are joining, and are they too woke coming in to the military? But it looks like the, wokeness is really coming top down, if I heard you correctly. Like that's the real concern.
That, personally, that's a good way to look at it. We are concerned about that. Now, we're also concerned that over the last couple of years, the Navy and the other services too have had difficulty in filling their recruiting quotas. And a lot of the drop off is from the demographic that has traditionally been
White men.
Well, it is
Black men too, right?
But you know what, Charles? It's also if the enlisted ranks were a university, they'd be called legacy students. It's people who have had family history
Right.
being in the military, and that has dropped off precipitously. And there's concern about that. Just recently, there was a report that and this is the person who put this out was the commander of Fleet Forces. It's a 4-star admiral. And he said that they are deploying right now, the Navy's deploying, and that's about 100 ships or so. And they're deploying 20,000 sailors short. When I was deploying back in the 80s, we did not deploy short by one person. If we were short a person, the wing commander grabbed somebody and sent him temporary duty to work with us while we were deployed, because we just didn't do that. And so being short that much is really hard, because those guys are working. When you're at sea, it's 24/7, round the clock. You're always working, and it's really, really rough. They stand 4 hours on, 8 hour off watches. So you look at that, and you've got, in your 8 hours off, you've got to do your real job besides just the watch standing. So it's a very challenging, very stressful situation. And I don't know if you recall, but there was a case 5-6 years ago of a couple of collisions in the Western Pacific.
Yep.
The Fitzgerald and the McCain. And the crews responded well, but part of that was the crews were also stressed, and there was not a great deal of empathy at the senior 3- and 4-star level. Wow. And this is one of the things. So I retired as a captain. Okay, so I worked for a friend. I worked for a friend once when I was in there, and he said, there's only 2 types of Navy captains: those who want to be admirals and those that are lying about it. But it's difficult for me to listen to a 4-star admiral say, I can't take this up to the CNO because it'll jeopardize my career. Excuse me, you're a 4-star admiral. You're about as high as you're going to get, fella.
Right.
Well, people are always looking at the next step until you get to the top one, right?
Yeah, that's true.
But we need to refocus this, and DEI is part of that. It's certainly not the only issue, but it's part of it, and it's a big part of it. Now, if it's okay, I'd like to relay a little bit about why I became so interested in diversity.
Okay.
About 25 years ago, I was working for Boeing, and I was the executive liaison with the Santa Fe Institute, which is a self-funded research organization, interestingly enough, in Santa Fe. And Boeing was part of their business network, and they routinely visit the major players in their business network and put on a one-day seminar. I was the executive liaison, so I co-hosted that, and the seminar was on diversity. It was chaired by Professor Scott Page from the University of Michigan, who was external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute. And it was all about cognitive diversity. And I was really struck by what Scott had to say. And I have maintained touch with him, read all his books, read some of his papers, and even understood some of them. But it's really interesting. And cognitive diversity can actually be a performance enhancer. I mean, Scott has developed the empirical data, laid it all out, and he's developed the theory behind why it works. And I find that to be very interesting. So it's not like diversity and everything is bad. It's not. It's just we need to look at those things that add power to what we're trying to do, to mission accomplishment, and how that plays out. And it's really, really interesting. And I'll send you this sometime. He wrote a book called The Diversity Bonus, which is written, unlike some of his previous books, it's written for the general public at large. It's a pretty interesting book. It's a pretty interesting book. Gives you some insight into how diversity plays and why it's a good thing. So with that.
Yeah, Christy's writing that down for us. Oh, Wilfred, what would you like to add about any of his concerns or his intro?
Yeah, I mean, it's none of that is especially surprising. I mean, the guy who was accused of insensitive posting during the George Floyd riots, I mean, that strikes me as somewhat insane. I mean, I said on social media during this period that, I mean, most societies throughout history have just killed rioters that did things like try to burn down police stations. And I mean, that, whether you like it or not, was a pretty effective policy. That's something almost no one has ever tolerated. Obviously, peaceful protest is something completely different from what you saw in Minneapolis, where you had there was a street battle between the rioters and the cops with sort of medieval weapons that went on for hours, where the police were finally ordered to retreat because otherwise they'd have to start killing rioters. And so a police station was burnt down. It was like the Midwest Police Museum was in the station. So I think someone saying this is absolutely ridiculous, we got to worry about the cops as opposed to these quote unquote scumbags setting buildings on fire, I don't find that controversial in the least bit. But I mean, in terms of the things that Guy is saying about the impact of a really specific approach to diversity in the military, it's an interesting topic, which is why we wanted to do this episode, right? Because I mean, we've seen the same thing in law, in elite business. Diversity, if you just have a bunch of people that think differently, is good. And like race actually correlates with that to some extent at 0.3 or whatever it is. But the idea that you should just bring in people of different backgrounds, regardless of whether they're qualified or not, and sort of, I mean, you say that the academy is not relaxing standards, which is good, but sort of ensure that they all make it to the end game, which is pretty common. I haven't personally found in any kind of leadership role that has the same effects. I mean, in terms of, and I don't want to like go on and on, but in terms of the comment, like, well, it's hard to tell because no college has released this information unless they're absolutely forced to. But it's hard to tell if the academy is lowering standards to be X% female and X% black, X% certainly Latino. The answer would almost certainly be yes. I mean, there are large test score differences among groups in the country right now. I mean, the academy's mostly historically been white men with a large subset of black males. Those I would assume are the people that are most interested in serving in or fighting in the U.S. Navy or Marines. I mean, all data shows that. So, I mean, if you want to get a certain number of Hispanic, or even just focusing on my group, like there are only 3,000 black kids that got over a 1,400 on the SAT with that focused in math last year. So, I mean, if you see Harvard, West Point, Naval Academy, U Chicago, MIT, all these schools consistently being 15% black, I mean, they're still good kids getting in, but obviously you're giving some kind of leeway there. That's just mathematics. So yeah, I tend to disapprove of that. And I mean, I would also tend to think that if you go to say Hispanic females, that effect would get larger. When you look at the number of Hispanic women that want to join the Navy at the officer level, I mean, I assume there's substantial male-female differences there. But I mean, that's just one obvious point. The thing that's really interesting about what you said and the comments from Charles, from other people on the panel, this seems to be almost totally a top-down thing. So the students might be a little liberal, they might look a little different, but the crazy thing really is the CNO or these cabinet level individuals saying this is what we're going to do at the Naval Academy. That to me, I teach at State University, and I've given speeches at other universities at Fortune 500s, all that. That's what you usually see. It's the CMO or someone like that comes in and says, well, this is what we're going to do. There's not really, if you look at Harley Davidson and all that, Anheuser-Busch, there's not any consultation with customers, salespeople, junior executives. It's not bottom up at all. It's just sort of, well, we're going to try to appeal to the LGBT market with 8% of our product this year. And I mean, we saw what that did with InBev. It's unfortunate to see that in the military. I mean, I've got to have another question later, which will be basically like, how the hell did that happen?
Right.
But it seems like this is the same thing that we've seen kind of everywhere else.
Well, let me ask you this question to that, Gay. I know you're going to reply, but let me put a question behind it. In that you can respond to Will, but keep this in mind. You just said the year you graduated the academy.
69. 69. I
69.
graduated.
Oh, you went in 69.
69.
Right. But that's right smack in the middle of this progression it was having. And so you weren't there in the 50s and the 40s of Staines and Eisenhower and Truman, and they did their thing. But setting aside our views on whether it works or it's right in the DEI, why the military? I get we believe they're right, and this is there's these inequalities and we need to fix them. Okay, colleges in Hollywood, okay, the music charts and sports, okay. But the military was the one organization that was doing it, right? It's the one organization where no one else allowed Blacks and other groups to get in. It's the one organization that did it, the one organization that had one standard. Now you can complain down the road, and they just took them a while to fix that from the officer and the higher ups level as they moved up. But really, you're gonna revamp and focus, and train people, and from the top down talk about diversity and equity when you were basically the catalyst for it throughout the country. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that we have essentially been a peacetime Navy since 1975. Yes, we had Iraqi freedom and enduring freedom, and we had, various Panama and Noriega and those things, but we've basically been a peacetime Navy. And a lot of people like to point to Harry Truman and say, well, look, he desegregated the military, and that was a social experiment. He used the military as a forcing function. We're just doing the same thing. Okay. And I would argue that that's not necessarily true, because the difference is we are now at risk of compromising standards. Wilford pointed out that there's only 3,000, I think was the number, 1,400 on their SATs.
Yeah, Black kids over 1,400 or 1,390 on the test in the country. Now, bear in mind, it's only 11% of whites or something, but it's like 4% of African Americans that were a smaller group. So yeah, you can't do it. So, and there is, I was stunned to find about 6 months ago that there's a thing called the National Center for Educational Statistics. Now, you may know that that's there, but I didn't. And I was, plowing through it, and I serendipitously came across a thing that said 64% of minority students, primarily Black and Hispanic, attend, their words, poorly performing schools. And if that's true, there's still students there who can earn a good education, but the odds are really stacked against them if it's a poorly performing school. And just recently, Larry Elder came out and talked about the schools in Chicago and how poorly they were doing, in that single digit or even 0% of the kids in these inner city schools were able to perform at grade level in math and literature. And
I hate to cut you off while you're on the rant. Don't forget where you are, but I got to throw this out there when I've talked about, because education is obviously my bellywood. Just think about the fact that I know it's sad, but only, there's 42% of whites who aren't proficient either. Everyone's failing. Nobody can read and do math anymore.
Absolutely, Charles.
So yeah, 67, 42 is still pretty bad.
There are more whites, though. That's the thing. Like, it's good that Black conservatives,
right? So you got some left
like, don't be racist about this. It's 40% of whites, 20% of Blacks, 17% of Hispanics, or whatever. But I mean, there are a lot more Caucasians. It's still 60% of the country, so it's easier to fill them into spots in schools. Right? Like, we're doing even worse, and we're a sixth the size of the population.
Yeah.
So, right. Carry on, guy.
Sure. By the way, Colorado ranks 8th in the country, number one being the best, ranks 8th in the country in terms of public education, and it is 47.9% perform at grade level. And Colorado's a
Oh,
very
wow.
young state. So, yeah, your point is exactly right.
Oh,
You know,
do you spend $1
that
million a kid like New York City, like we do?
no, not quite that much, but it's pushing 20K.
Wow.
I hate we're going off on tangents, but so I'm on the school board here. We just had our meeting yesterday, so it's fresh. You know, outside of debating LGBTQ and trans, because we do that every meeting. That's like a non-issue. It's guaranteed. It's like written in the contract. We have to start with the first 2 hours arguing about that. But you know the other thing we mentioned was whether we should offer public school students free omnicars, bus and subway passes, because they get them if they live outside of a certain distance from the school. They're like, but what if you live inside that distance, but you got to go for after school or sports or whatever? It seems reasonable, right? Everybody go, okay, fine, let's give it to them. Then they're like, well, what if they work on the weekend? I'm thinking, don't they get paid? We should give it to them. They say, well, it wouldn't be fair to give it to them and not give it to private school students. Then by the end, I swear to God, by the end when we were voting, we were like, well, public transportation should be free anyway. So let's just give it to all the kids. So now we're voting on whether we should give every. And I said, well, you just are. If your argument, because I'm a logical guy, I'm not saying whether you're right or wrong. If your argument is that public transportation by the very nation should be free, why are we debating whether public school kids should get the Omni card? Shouldn't every citizen just start? Shouldn't we just open the doors on the buses and the subways there, tear down the turnstile? That's what we were talking about. In a city that already spend the most money on every student, and they're about 40.
Well, this is where all this stuff always ends up to some extent. It's just communism. Like, not a long sideline on this, but like every time you see this all the time on Twitter and Facebook, like they're kids that are doing a car wash to raise money for old ladies or something, and someone will chime in like, "This isn't a sign of a good civilized country that you have to do charity to help out the weakest in your society." And where that would end up is always something like this, like the school district gives everyone under 18 in the city, because everyone goes to school, like full access to all transportation every day.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
That's a crazy thing. First of all,
Wow.
leaving crime rates aside, that's just a crazy thing to do. It's a crazy thing for the schools to take on. Feeding all of the kids in the school is itself way beyond the
Yep.
mission of the school.
People, well, you all have seen it. People tend to perform up to expectations or down to
Absolutely.
expectations. And so the more that they expect to be taken care of, the more they'll let themselves be taken care of. And
Full
I think,
disclosure, lest I get attacked, because somebody would Google this and say, aha, in your face, he lied and left this out on purpose. You all are going to be shocked. Don't drop your book, Will. I voted yes to the resolution.
Did you?
I decided to throw them a bone. I'm like,
Wow.
you're gonna do it anyway. I'm like, fine, do it. Because otherwise it would have been
Were you
11
sick?
No,
Were
no,
you sick?
otherwise it was, I said I should have done it was gonna be, I think it was 10 of it. It was gonna be 9-1 if I voted no. So it was passing anyway. I'm like, fine, I'll throw you a bone, and I voted.
May as well look like you're a team
Look
player.
like the guy who wants to let the kids go to school.
so that's an interesting comment. In the military, unity is really, really important.
Right. But so is truth. But so is truth.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so unity is really important. But this whole diversity thing, by looking at people in silos, this silo, the L silo, the G silo, the B silo, the black silo, the Hispanic silo, the Polish silo, that's me, the Polish silo. That is not something that inherently contributes to unity.
Right.
Now, having said that, there's two very distinct areas. I don't want to make them too definitive, okay? But you have the planning area and you have the execution area. And I mentioned my interest in cognitive diversity, and I keep getting told by my compatriots that cognitive diversity doesn't help you in a firefight, because that's, everybody's got to play as a team and you can't have a meeting and da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, that's absolutely right, okay? But planning for that firefight, planning for that raid, planning for that invasion, where you bring together people who have a common purpose, but who think about things differently. And you think about things differently because of your family, your personal history, your educational background, all those different things that make up the person that you are. Every one of us is unique. I want it to be known that as an engineer, I did not say very unique, because unique is by itself very. So it's important in that planning area is where cognitive diversity, which, Wilfred, as you said, it plays. It plays. And if you pick a number of people who have knowledge of the area that you're working in, and you pick them for their ability to think differently, which is not a trivial thing, you're going to probably find yourself with a bunch of people that don't look alike. And that's just fine, because you want them for their ability to think differently from one another and to be able to work together to build on it. But it is highly unlikely that that will be a frictionless team, because as human beings, we have to really work at integrating our thoughts with somebody who thinks very differently. But that's an important factor of leadership. How do you lead a team that is cognitively diverse? We need to help people understand that. But this whole thing that we were talking about, Charles, with the abysmal performance of schools in general, how many minds are we wasting? You remember when the HBCUs had the advertisement, the mind is a terrible thing to waste? It still is. It still is. And we ought not be wasting these half of the kids that are out there. Now, not everybody is going to perform at the 90th percentile, and that's okay, because 90th percentile has always got, 90% of the people below it. So this ain't late, woe be gone. So but it's important that kids learn enough to be able to function as citizens, to be able to join the military. I forget, let's see, the Naval Academy had 16,000 applicants a couple of years ago for like the class of 22 or something.
Oh, okay.
And of those 16,000, 11,000 were not qualified. And most of that was for physical reasons.
Oh, yeah.
But a fair number of them were athletic reasons, and there were a few medical reasons, but relatively few medical reasons other than being overweight or physically unfit. I got no reason.
Oh, side note again, you say, being overweight. Have they raised the standard? They had to, overweight in 1969 had to be lower than overweight today, because nobody would be in the Naval Academy.
I don't know. That's a good question, Charles.
Right. So the term is the same, but the weight has to be different by at least 9.5 pounds.
9.5. I'll have to look.
That's my guess. And I'm being generous. It probably should be 12, but it's probably not.
So interestingly enough, when I went to the Naval Academy, when I applied, you had to have at least 16 teeth.
That's
16 teeth?
That's not a high bar. Most people in Kentucky have
Anti-Southern discrimination.
Well,
Yeah. No,
I have a question.
That's really funny.
Oh, Christy has a question.
I have a
Yes,
question.
ma'am.
So when I was reading about this a little bit, and just from I come from a military family, so there's a lot of people in my family that are military. But when you think about the most woke branch and the least woke branch, right? We would all guess right away, even if we didn't know, that it's the Marines. The Marines is the least woke for obvious reasons.
The most. Okay.
No, and then the Navy and the Air Force tend to be, the most woke now. And so I started thinking about it. Yeah, is that because traditionally those are the branches that were, the least diverse, right? So it was harder to get into the Air Force than, say, the Army, or even maybe the Marines. So is there some overcompensating that they're trying to do, or is there something else at play why those two branches tend to be a little more woke?
So that's a very interesting question, Christy, and I can't claim to have any inside knowledge right now of why people did that. But I will tell you that right now, the Air Force Academy is far and away the most woke, and West Point is second, and Navy is third.
Yeah.
And I attend the meeting, our sister organization for the Air Force Academy is called STARS, and I attend their weekly staff meeting, and the MacArthur Society is West Point's equivalent. And by West Point and Stars both agree that the Air Force Academy is the most and the Naval Academy is the least, but it doesn't mean that it's zero. Okay.
Right.
I mean, the Naval Academy actually has, and I will display some bias here, okay? The Naval Academy actually has midshipmen in each company. There's 36 companies in the Brigade of Midshipmen. Each company has a DEI cadet, a senior who is the guy doing that. That strikes us as like the Soviet Union Zampolit that had to be with every military organization to make sure that they hewed to the doctrines of Marxist-Leninism. And we see that as being a very detrimental thing. So the Naval Academy is certainly embroiled in this. And given that it is a priority for the Secretary of Defense, you would be surprised if they weren't. Yes, Chuck.
Can I offer a suggestion, Christy, and hear what you say? It's not evidence-based. I'm just thinking. So, bear with me. And my military knowledge of people in the military would have been years ago. I don't know. It's not like I know people joining now. So I'm thinking, late 70s through early 90s. And I would think, you got a group of people who don't even consider the military, but of those people consider and decide that they want to go. Traditionally speaking, in the time frame I'm speaking of, when they decide what branch they're going to join, the people who tend to go to the Air Force were thinking that they would be less likely to be in combat. So if that's what they're thinking, then the people who are going to Army and going to be if they're going to be a Marine or if they're going to be a SEAL, they have a different mindset anyway, right? So you take them away. So if they say I'm joining, but because I care about my country or whatever, but I like to be as far away and be less likely. I want to be the last guy called. I want to be less likely when I am called to go whatever. That tended to be of the people that I knew who enlisted would be the Air Force. That being the case, that may be why that became the branch that was inflicted the most. Thoughts amongst the group.
That's an interesting insight, and I think that probably has a good deal of validity to it. That is an interesting insight. I'll put that in my list of things to think
Yeah,
about.
but then listen to think. It's not scientific, but that's what I think, and that's just from the people that I know when they chose the branch.
When I worked at Boeing, I had a guy working for me who was a retired Air Force colonel, fighter pilot. And I was sitting in his office one day and I said, John, could you tell me why in the Air Force you can only do those things that are explicitly allowed? And in the Navy, I could do anything that was not explicitly forbidden.
That's like the
And
10th Amendment.
he looked at me and he said, duh, it's because you guys started before the invention of the radio. So it's the ability to reach down, and it is a cultural thing in the Air Force to be able to reach back and get permission to do things, and much less so in the Navy. And so there are in fact different cultures there.
Right.
If you get outside the Washington Beltway, the services get along pretty well together. Inside the Washington Beltway and absolutely inside the Pentagon, it is a knife fight in the phone booth. I mean,
wow.
It is, well, they're fighting over money.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
I had one other little thing. So my niece is
my
niece is a pilot in the Air Force, and she actually was part of the team that evacuated Afghanistan. So when she did that mission, she got awarded the Flying Cross. And when she got the award, they made a big to-do about her being the first Black woman to have, received the cross. And you can look up the interview, and her face was like, really? And it was kind of a thing like, no, that didn't happen before now. And why is this a big deal? Right. But they made a big deal of that being like celebrated Women's Month, women's achievement, Black woman, magic. And yeah.
It's not that long, Christy, since women were allowed to participate in combat operations too. So it's really not that long a period of time. It's years, okay, but it's not decades that women have been allowed to participate in combat operations. And given that there's relatively few combat operations in the last 10 years, it sounds like a lot, but relatively speaking, it's not. And And so I'm not terribly surprised that she's the first Black woman to get that. So, and by the way, DFC is a big deal.
But right, it is. But this also goes to the fact of it being top down rather than bottom up. Because for her, she was just doing her job, and it was great. But for them, it was, this Black woman, this first, and she was like, really? This never happened before then? Like the kids don't make it a big deal. The kids aren't the ones that are, go CRT. It's really, seems like it's the leadership.
So I'm a former president of the Colorado chapter of the Naval Academy Alumni Association, and we have an annual dinner. And our speakers, pre-COVID, our guest speaker was Admiral 4-star Admiral Michelle Howard. Okay, and Michelle is 5 foot nothing, and she graduated from Naval Academy class of '83. And she had a phenomenal career, as you can imagine, be promoted to 4-star. Absolutely breathtaking career. But every job she went to, she said, I was always the one that was being interviewed because I was the first, I was the first this, I was the first that. And she said, really, so she called her mother one time because she wanted somebody to a shoulder to cry on. And her mother said, Michelle, if you're not prepared to deal with that, then maybe you're in the wrong career. And Admiral Howard said, that was not what I called my mother.
That's not what I wanted to hear. Yeah.
But she told a story when she came and spoke. She said, when she was the commanding officer of a destroyer, she made it a point to go to the local elementary schools and give about a 5 or 6 minute talk and then let the kids ask questions. And so she was at this one class and this little kid stands up and says, you said that you're the commanding officer of a warship? And she goes, yes, I am. And he says, well, how can that be?
You're a girl.
And she said, oh God, here comes the question. And he says, so short. The fact that she was a Black woman didn't bother him at all. I think that is a wonderful observation. He thought she was too short, and us short people don't like
That's
that.
funny. I want to ask Will a question, but before I get to him, I do want to, kind of. I won't really say. I guess I say play devil's advocate in the sense to the people who are saying, because we're all pushing back against it or whatever, and because we care about whether it's effective, But some people will say it's DEI is good, it's important because all this other stuff, and it's not really harming anything. So Will might be right about his 3,000 number. And yes, they're admitting more people, but you say you don't think they're lowering the standards. They're just spending more. You don't know for sure, but they're spending more money to train them and get them there. I mean, okay, we had a couple close calls, but other than that, things are going swimmingly. So what makes you think it's bad?
Well, so the thing is, and I've made this same argument. So Wilford talked about the 3,000, okay, but
I'm one of those three. Oh, no.
If the by the way, I'm not. My were 697 and 693, so I fall just short of that, Wilford.
Solid, yeah.
But if the criteria is the 90th percentile, and we admit a kid who's the 80th percentile, 80th percentile is pretty doggone good. Okay, nothing to be ashamed of.
Right.
But if the academics are targeted at the 90th percentile student and above, then have we placed an undue burden on the 80th percentile kid? Maybe they'll succeed, and that's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The company that I graduated in from the academy was the 23rd company, and one of my classmates, a wonderful friend, Ed Langston. Ed retired as a 1-star Marine general. Okay, Ed graduated with a QPR GPA of 2.01. So academics isn't necessarily a precursor to career success. And the number one guy in my class retired as a captain, just like I did. So that's not necessarily the criteria. And the academy says that they try to select based on the whole person. And we have no objection to that, but we'd like to know what the whole person is. How do you come up with this? And we're not looking for some kind of mechanical scheme where it's just, no judgment goes into it. But we would like to understand that we're not compromising standards.
I think the advertisement we've seen shows us what the whole person includes. It includes their sexual orientation and who they date,
Skin color.
right? Oh, that's because they say it openly.
Okay. Why does that contribute to mission accomplishment?
They would say, okay, I'm going to channel. They would say because colored folks and gays, oh, they wouldn't use those terms, but I'm sorry. They would say because people's lived experiences bring something to the table, and you could have varied grades, like you just said, and different GPAs, but there is something unique about the lived experience of a Black person, a woman, and an LGBT person, and that lived experience mixed with the other people's lived experience will enhance the whole, because now you have these diverse looks and thoughts and all these different things.
So what you're telling me, Charles, is that lived experience, okay, that lived experience has influenced something.
Mm-hmm.
What has it influenced? And I'll posit for you, it has influenced the way they think about things.
Right.
The way they see the world and categorize it.
Yep.
The way they solve problems.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they predict the outcomes of their decisions or problem solutions.
And they would say that's the cognitive diversity you want. I just gave it to you.
That's
I mean, I'm sure
okay?
both of you guys are highly intelligent men. You're just going back and forth for practice, but the obvious point would then just be, why not just select for cognitive diversity?
And that's where I'm going, Wilford.
I know. I didn't mean to cut
because I can't see it.
It could
I
have
need
gone
to
on for a
see it.
while there.
Because
That's
I need
right.
to see it,
That's
and
right,
I can
because
see it if the person
can't-
is trans and Black and
You can't measure it, you can't weigh it, you can't feel it.
Right. I want to be able to feel it and touch it and taste it.
And I struggled with this at Boeing, okay? When I interviewed people, how do I find out that somebody is likely to be cognitively diverse with respect to the other members that they're going to be working with? Because a person standing alone in the middle of a field cannot be cognitively diverse. You have to be diverse with respect to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you've got to run it by legal, but just as a comment, one of my experiences as a boss is that you can kind of just ask them. Like, this isn't like pregnancy or something like that. I mean, you can ask, like, how would you solve this problem in a leadership role? I don't, in a private lunch, or you're a Republican. I mean, like, it's not the most tough. No, but I mean, it's not the toughest question to ask, right? And this is briefly, I think, a problem that a lot of people have with DEI. Like, the core idea, you can argue whether or not HR would let you do it, but it's really simple. Like, you want diversity, you hire 10% Black guys if you're looking for race. Just do that for a couple of years. If you're looking for cognitive diversity, there's not even a legal issue. Just ask people, how would you handle this situation, the retention of nobles in the old British Parliament, the House of Commons or something like that. And you'd see right across the map who's liberal, who's conservative, who's high IQ, who's lower IQ. So the idea that you need to have 7% Asian guys to get cognitive diversity is something that's always, and I mean, Christy, I know you know this, Charles, I know you know this. It's kind of a smoke screen for, we want 7% Asian guys.
Right.
And I mean, I think either option, just saying like, look, we're going to play fast and loose for 2 years and hire 7% Asians, and that's it. Then they have to get along with everyone else. Or even better, saying we're actually going to hire people over here who can demonstrate they think differently in response to this series of tests from Mensa or whatever. Either of those approaches is better than just hiring 7% Asian men and hoping they'll think differently from upper middle class white and Black men. There's no evidence for the last one at all. And that's something I keep seeing.
And it's also a problem because they're assuming they all think the same way.
Well, less from me, but what you normally get in these situations is like a bunch of upper middle class, slanted male, center left liberals that all think pretty much alike. Like, if you're just hiring based on color, like, I go to academic conferences all the time. I'm pretty good. And I mean, you see, like, you got a Black guy, white guy, Asian woman, and the paper they all worked on together is called, like, The Horror of Racist Patriarchy. So, like, just having the three people
Absolutely.
doesn't mean anything if they all went to Choate and have an IQ of 118 and grew up in New York but now live in Chicago and so on and so on and so on.
Absolutely. And I agree with everything you said there, Wilfred, not just because you let me come on your podcast.
Yeah, not just.
I do agree with that. And that's what it boiled down to. How would you solve this problem?
Right, right.
You know, and you tend to get people who do think differently like that. And when I started doing that, I did find myself with fewer white guys.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm actually not surprised. That last line is worth re-emphasizing from a Caucasian boss. Like, I think there's this idea that either the country is, run by racist, sexists or whatever, or minorities are stupid. And so if you allow fair competition, you'll just wind up with 100 white dudes. No, you'll wind up with a disproportionate number of Asians, Nigerians, and so on, and like a 60% proportionate number of blacks, Hispanics. You'll wind up with a lot of Jewish Americans. Like, no, every time I've done this, you get a group of people that look pretty much like America, like maybe a little more Asian, a little less black, but just it looks the same. That's the most important thing about this. We're wasting tens of millions of dollars on the less effective way to do this.
I agree absolutely. And if you look at a meritocracy, okay, NFL offensive and defensive lines,
Oh yeah.
okay, those guys get chosen for their ability to perform on the offensive or defensive line, period. Well, there's some getting along with their teammates too, okay? But based on that's merit. And what do you get? You get a line that has some black guys, and you get a line that has some white guys. And there's probably more black guys on those lines because by golly, that's someplace that they think, from sixth grade on up that they can play that game in there. And there's some self-selection that goes on, and that's fine. We are free to make those kinds of decisions.
Right, right. You can't control what people practice at from 12 to 16 to get good at, and then see them all at 19 and they're shocked that there's a certain group of people better at it. It just happens. I'm assuming in all your your 3 retirements and the many things you've done in the past, your time at Boeing, that you've had that the time and the opportunities to speak to some of the younger, I mean, there's not many young in the book, but some of the younger officers or people, or hear from other people that have done so. So what do you think they think of it? I know Christy said that when she talks to her niece and others that they're not buying it, or they're just disinterested in it. They're not excited about it. What do you think most of the younger officers think?
I think that like any significantly sized group, you're going to have some of those young people who are very much leaning in the direction of DEI because it sounds fair to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I'll give you an example here. The 1619 project was added to an optional reading list at the Naval Academy. The feedback that I got was that within a week, the midshipmen had found over 1,000 factual errors in the 1619 project. So it's pretty apparent that there's a substantial number of them that are not buying into this wholeheartedly. And I've heard that separately from some of my classmates who live in Annapolis and have talked to some of the mids, and particularly those who are in the engineering and the STEM fields. They don't feel any pressure in that. They're pretty insensitive to it. So I think that we need to be careful not to overreact to this, but I think that it is an issue, and it is an issue not just for the military, but for the nation at large, because it's important for us if we want to maintain the American dream, the lifestyle. Everybody has to be part of it. We have to be e pluribus unum. We have to be a United States. And I worked with a guy who said, there's somebody in the United States who knows the solution or the information to solve every problem. The difficulty is finding that person or those people.
Right.
And that has to include all 330 million, whatever of us, all of us, because we can all contribute to that. I feel really strongly about that.
Right. I just want to say that kudos to the midshipmen who found 1,000 errors in the 1619 project. But as someone who wrote a book about it, and Will, who writes and speaks on it, they missed 6. I just want to let you know. They missed 6, and I challenged them to find them and send them to us.
Is there any like? Do you guys have a copy of like a document the midshipmen put together? Like,
Are
I'd
they
be glad to
marked
give
up?
that some
That would be
publicity.
hilarious.
I tried to find that, Wilford, and I couldn't get it.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Yeah,
Christy,
if that ever comes up, I'd be more than glad to just say, our up and coming young officers are on the job or something. That would be very funny and probably draw televised attention, although not to the young men by name, young men and women. But like that actually doesn't surprise me at all. Like the whole 1619 project thing, like we didn't have slavery in 1619. So everyone that came over, like white or black, was sort of a bond servant captured in war. This is actually an important distinction. Most of these people, 85%, were white at this time. That's where we got a lot of the population of where I live. Slavery was established when white and black masses, like Anthony Johnson in the 1660s, started suing and saying that their servants couldn't leave. And what the court said is, well, you can probably leave if you're white, although you have to serve 23 years instead of 7, but you can't leave if you're black. And that's when chattel slavery began. So like the whole thing from the beginning was just full of these like obvious, did they search this on some Wikipedia? Like it was full of these major errors. Not that everyone doesn't look at encyclopedias for their books and so on, but that surprised me as you kept tracking through it.
right. It was crazy. Christy, would you like to ask a final question? I'll throw you the mic to ask the final question if you have one.
No, that was just my comment and my observation was where is all this going? Do you see it getting, worse as far as leaning into the DEI, or is it correcting itself? Returning back to some sense of sanity?
I think that there is some motion. I think the pendulum is beginning to swing back. I think it's important to recognize that we do not want that pendulum to swing back too far. Human beings are really good at overcorrecting, and we don't want to do that. I think that what we want to do is ask ourselves that if the complaint that minorities are underrepresented in the elite organizations, whatever those are, okay, if they are underrepresented, what's the reason? And I think that needs to go back to the point that we were making earlier about our educational system and how poorly that's preparing kids, and minorities are at a significant disadvantage, even with respect to the abysmal performance of the school systems as a whole. And so let's fix that. And I don't think money is the answer to that, but that's a personal opinion.
No, you're definitely right about that. I think that's a good place to leave it. I want to say thank you for coming on, but also for carrying the load when the expectation that you would have there'd be a tag team going on here. Tell Bruce Davey he's dead to me. And
that is a horrible joke.
I can't. He can come and talk about the book as well. And this is the book, Don't Give Up the Ship. And he is Captain Guy Higgins.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
It's great having you. Thanks.
Great having you on.
Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.